Listen.
This is a journey into sound.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Happy birthday to
The best a man can get.
Always Coca-Cola.
Richard Roth, CNN, United Nations.
A variety of sounds, some of them made by brands and many of them iconic. I'm sure you recognize most of them. All brands are making sound. So if I stick a brand in the middle of that picture, you can imagine the sound coming out from every brand. If you're running a brand, your brand is making sound. The question is how much of it is intentional and what's it doing? Because sound affects people in 4 major ways. I've got another whole TED talk about that, and I'm not going to go into it in detail today, but these are the 4 ways. And I'd like to reflect particularly today on one of them, the second of those, because it resonates with everything that we've been hearing all day today. Sound affects us psychologically. It changes our feelings, our moods, our emotions. This is a quote from Robert Pasikoff, the American brand guru, and I don't really need to validate this anymore after what we've heard this morning from much more august speakers than I am about the way in which we make buying decisions. If you do need any more proof, this is a study done by the Institute of Practitioners of Advertising on 1,400 advertising campaigns. And what it says effectively is the effectiveness of advertising campaigns that were primarily emotional is double the effectiveness of advertising campaigns that were primarily rational. So appealing to the feelings works. Now, if we were to draw one of those lovely spaces that we enjoy so much in the marketing world with 2 axes and take that emotional, rational dimension and also add a dimension of conscious to non-conscious, I think today, after what we've heard, we're all pretty confident that the vast majority of buying decisions take place down here. This is the interesting sector. And the question is, how do we as marketers get to this sector? You know, I'm very familiar with walking out of shops with a little bit of rational conscious going on. Yep, that was a good thing to buy, as we heard earlier from Professor Tim Ambler. And there's a bit of non-conscious rational. I wouldn't buy a pair of shoes for £50,000. That's just stupid to me. Then there's a bit of conscious emotional. I really like that. But there's a huge amount going on there. Under the radar, non-conscious, emotional. The question is, how do we get to that? And the answer is through the senses. The senses are the gateways to the emotions. This is a guess, for me personally, at the way that my senses work. The blue lines, or the blue elements in these bars, are conscious. So my sight, for example, is very conscious. I know where I'm looking. I can close my eyes. It's directed, and I'm very conscious about what I'm seeing. Yes, there's peripheral vision, but most of the time, and most of what I see, I'm pretty conscious of. Sound, on the other hand, and even though I'm a practiced listener, a huge amount of the sound that goes on is unconscious, because I, like all of us, I'm very used to suppressing noise all around me. The same is true for smell. So the senses have different quantities of conscious and non-conscious going on in them. And that's why they are the gateways to the emotions. And yet, I wonder if you can guess the proportion of marketing spend which goes on these. Well, it's a very high proportion. This is taken from Martin Lindstrom's book, Brand Sense. 86% of all the money that's spent on marketing is spent on the eyes. Now, that's out of whack. And I want to show you why it's out of whack. One of the big reasons it's out of whack is because of this wonderful concept, superadditivity, which has been validated by Professor Charles Spence at Oxford University, among many other cross-modal researchers. They're looking at the relationship between different senses. And this is just one example, which I passionately love because I'm a sound guy. If you take a visual message and you add a congruent oral message, audio message, you increase the impact by 1,100%. That is to say, 1 + 1 = 12. Not 2, but 12. And as you add senses, that kind of multiplier effect is cumulative. So for brands, this is a very important argument. And I would like to take you through the 8 ways in which a brand can express itself in sound. So let's start with 1 o'clock up there, brand voice. By this, I mean literally brand voice. I'm not talking about metaphorically here, like agencies talk about tone of voice. This is literally brand voice. How would the brand sound if you spoke to it? Is it old or young? masculine or feminine, lively and bubbly, or laid back and formal and professional. The first time I got on a Virgin Atlantic aeroplane, the stewardess said to me, "Hello, sexy." Now, I hope she meant it. If she worked for British Airways, she probably would have been sacked for saying that. Working for Virgin, that was perfect. That is Virgin's brand voice. It's cheeky, it's irreverent, it's informal, and it's surprising. So I don't think she was trained to say that, but she understood the brand at her heart, and she was given permission to say that. Brand voice is very, very significant. And I'm talking about voice on the telephone, call centers, giving some consistency to the conversations we have with brands. Brand music. Music is a very, very powerful form of sound. Those of you who've traveled with British Airways, whom I just mentioned, will recognize this piece of music. This is the Flower Duet from an opera called Lakmé by Delibes. And British Airways have been using this piece of music forever. They use it everywhere, actually, on the plane, on the phone, on the web, everywhere. They're very associated with this piece of music. But a few years ago, they sacked their advertising agency, and the new agency thought, we'll get rid of that old classical nonsense, and they replaced it with this.
We believe your holiday should start before you arrive. You're our guest. You should expect to check in online. Choose where
Well,
to
that
sit.
song is Leaving on a
Fly
Jet
to
Plane,
destination.
the second line of which is Don't Know When I'll Be Back Again, which may not be the best message to give business travelers. It was composed by a guy called John Denver, who died in a plane crash. When British Airways did that, there was a rebellion. Their customers were up in arms. Where's our lovely bit of classical music? And after a little debacle where that song, where the Delibes was appropriated actually by a competitor for a while, they've got it back. But they still have not trademarked that, and you can do that with sound. It's called a sound mark, and I have no idea why BA haven't done that yet. The third of the 8 is sonic logo. This is what most people think I do when I talk to them at cocktail parties about doing audio branding. This is the most famous one in the world. Everybody knows that song. You don't buy Intel products. You've never seen an Intel product. You don't know what one looks like, probably, and yet you all know what it sounds like. That's Intel. But I'd like to talk about this one very briefly today. You may not know this piece of music. But you will recognize it in a moment. About here. Might ring a bell, turned into this. Which, ladies and gentlemen, is the world's most played tune? I've calculated that this tune is played 1.8 billion times a day. That is 20,000 times a second. Somebody's Nokia phone goes off with that tune. It's the default ringtone. It cost Nokia precisely 0 because it was the only out-of-copyright piece of music when they considered a candidate list for their default ringtone, and they chose it because it was going to cost them nothing. And it has had a fantastic effect on their recall. Look at that. That's the effect on the brand recognition of Nokia. They are aware they have to keep it moving forward because the Dom Jolly effect, which we've seen in the UK, can be serious, where it's considered to be a little bit stupid not to know how to change your default ringtone. However, they do know that. They change the arrangement with every different Nokia handset, and they're very keenly aware of the value of the asset. Next, we have advertising sound. I'm not going to say much about this. The advertising industry knows very well how to use sound. It's very old. This
They're great!
has been around for about 60 years. There have been 3 Tonys so far. They die off and get replaced every so often. Advertising agencies know very well how to use sound in TV commercials, certainly. They've learned a lot from the film industry, who are the best in the world at using this form of sound. They could be a little more consistent from time to time, but generally pretty good. So let's move on to branded audio. This is a relatively new form. It's been around in its old form like this for a while. These organizations, Hotel Kos, Buddha Bar, Café Del Mar, they've made far more money out of CDs than out of being a bar or a hotel. They've sold tens of millions of CDs of music compilations with their brand on. But these days it looks like this, and it can sound like this.
This is Alberto Salazar, your Nike running coach. This 30-minute
A brilliant example from Nike, where you get Alberto Salazar, world champion. You can have him on your iPod, talking you through the workout with the compliments of Nike. It's on brand, it's completely associated with using their product. It's a brand extension which is ideal, and that's branded audio. And then we have telephone sound. Oh dear, what a disaster. Press 1 for this, 3 for this, 5 for this. Slam the phone down in frustration because you can't talk to a real person. None of the options you want were featured. If you do get through to a real person, very often they're in a call center 7,000 miles away, working off a screen which doesn't have your question on it. It can be an extremely frustrating experience. And there's a long, long way to go, given that many businesses only exist, many brands only exist on the telephone, your credit card, your utility company. You see a bill, you phone them up. Those are the only two experiences you generally have of them. Serious problem, telephone sound. Product sound can be very powerful, as here. Harley-Davidson tried to trademark this, but they didn't get away with it because there are other engines that sound very similar to this. So they failed. Kellogg's did trademark their Crunch, and Apple, of course, have this sound, which anybody who uses a proper computer knows very, very well indeed. It's not just the sound of actually using the product itself, of course. That's the bullseye, the name and the actual usage of the product. But some products are silent. There is still the sound of the packaging, and there is also the sound of what goes on when you're using the product, or sound associated with the product. For example, Latin music with Bacardi, that kind of association. And finally, soundscapes. And I'm just going to go into this in a tad more detail just for the last couple of minutes. Most retail soundscapes have got three characteristics. The first is they're arbitrary. The second is that they're incongruent with the brand. And the third is that they're hostile. They make us feel like this. And that's crazy, because in shops you want people to stick around as a rule. I'll give you some examples of what I'm talking about. This is a shelf stacker in a supermarket, dropping trays in the aisle. If you can see it happening, it's not so bad, but try this on headphones and you get the real visceral effect. This is an old friend. I don't have to introduce this one to you. Tragically, these little chaps go around screaming until somebody finally puts them in a corner and puts them out of their misery, but there's nobody tasked with listening and oiling them or replacing them. This is a chiller cabinet. It looked fantastic. Mist drifting down across the vegetables. 75 decibels at 1 meter. Stand between two of those and it's like being in a factory, like being physically assaulted. And then music. And who thinks this is a pleasant retail environment? This is a straight recording. I haven't doctored this at all. Terrible little loudspeakers, awful choice of music, badly delivered, just a nightmare. And then just all the general stuff that goes on. This is doors open, street noise and pollution coming in. Bad acoustics, lousy shop announcements, noise everywhere. It's just not a pleasant experience in retail. And that's a shame, because if they get it right, the research shows, this is a famous study by Milliman, that you can put sales up 38% in a shop by getting the sound right. So they're all shooting themselves in the foot by getting it wrong. Just 3 examples to finish with. Starbucks would say they're pretty good at sound. I mean, we all know pretty much the musical territory Starbucks occupies, yes? There's a kind of funky world music, jazz, blues thing going on there. And yet putting that kind of music on top of this, this is just icing on mud. If you put music on top of noise like that, it's just more noise, and it's not pleasant. It may look like a cake, but it's not a cake. This is a study by North, Hargreaves and Macmillan. They did it in a supermarket with identical gondola end displays of French and German wine. And the test conditions were alternating days of French and German music. So on day 1, they had cheesy French accordion music. There was nothing particularly subtle about this test. On day 2, it was German Bierkeller music. On the French music days, French wine outsold German wine by 5 bottles to 1. Which may not be surprising because it's better. Most people prefer it. But I'm sorry to any Germans in the audience. On the German music days, however, German wine outsold French wine by 2 bottles to 1. Now, that is unusual. And if you'd asked the people coming out of the shop, did you buy that wine because of the German music playing, they would have said, what music? Because it goes in under the radar. This is an emotional connection that we're making. Second of the 3 short case studies. This is a wine cellar in a restaurant. They played alternating days of pop and classical music. Can you guess what happened? It's fairly clear, isn't it? On the classical music days, spending went up. It wasn't that people bought more bottles of wine, they just bought more expensive bottles of wine. Presumably, there was a bit of Vivaldi playing. They said to each other, let's have a good bottle tonight. Because people associate classical music with quality. And this is one we were involved with. BP found that their brand was being holed below the waterline by the terrible toilets. And I think we can all identify with that. So they did this program of 5-star bathrooms, which look very nice. They've got lovely pictures of sunflowers and fields. They're spotlessly clean, and we have put generative birdsong into those bathrooms. And the result is that customer satisfaction has gone up by 50%. So sound is having a significant effect in retail and commercial soundscapes. And I would like to just suggest that if a brand is a promise delivered, in other words, it's a promise that consistently matches, is matched by the experience that we receive, then what we need to move towards is a designed multimedia experience in all the senses. We experience the world in 5 senses, we experience brands in 5 senses, and therefore we should design them carefully. And that leads me to finish with 4 golden rules for commercial sound. The first is to make it congruent with your visual branding. Pointing in the same direction, take advantage of super additivity. The second is to make it appropriate. We don't want to be beating people over the head with sound, surprising them and shocking them. We'd like to be supporting them. So it should be entirely appropriate for the space and what people are doing. And the third, and possibly the most important of all, the Elizabethans described language, a conversation actually, as decorated silence, which is a description I love. Let's make all the sound that we make as brands valuable to people, not just veneer the world with music. And then we can test it and test it and test it again, because sometimes these countervailing influences are difficult to predict, and we just have to see what happens. I hope that's given you some ideas. This is my vision is that we move towards a world where brands are making intentional, well-designed sound. It's good for brands. They get higher sales. And for all of us as human beings, it means that we have an environment which is much more beautiful to enjoy. So that, to me, is sound business. Thank you very much.